Howdy, y'all. Today we're going to be talking about the cattle industry and how it developed between 1862 and 1876. We're also going to look at how some key individuals affected the development of the cattle industry. So getting straight into it then, and as it says there, I'm going to give you a brief history, a brief overview of why this came about, why this industry actually developed. So it started in Texas, which is a southern state in America, and it was mostly came about from the Mexican cowboys, which were called vaqueros. My Spanish pronunciation isn't great, but that's what it is, vaqueros. So basically, we know that America managed to fight successfully against the Mexicans, and it wasn't until 1848 that they actually won that war against the Mexicans. But in 1836, the Texan ranchers were able to drive out the Mexicans, and basically they took the cattle that was there. A big event that we haven't yet looked at, but we will come to look at, is the Civil War, which started in 1861 and ran until 1865. And this was between the southern and the northern states of America. So the southern states, the Confederate states, the ones that wanted to break away from the rest of America, fought, and the biggest issue was about slavery. When the Texans returned, when those southern people returned from fighting in the Civil War, what they found was, first of all, they were poor. They didn't have much money because they'd lost the Civil War. But also, they found loads and loads of cows, loads of cattle, these longhorn cows. And basically what they did was they saw an opportunity there, so they started rounding these cows up and trying to sell them on. So as I previously said, in 1865, the end of the Civil War, those people returning to Texas saw all these cows and saw an opportunity. However, the price of the meat, the beef, the price of the cows in Texas wasn't quite as good. It was low. It was anywhere between $1 and $5, whereas you could get many times more than that, up to $40 in the north or in the east for those cows. Now these could be used for many things. They could be used for their hides to make leather, obviously to eat as well, and also the fat could be used to make candles and soap. So there was definitely the possibility of using these animals for something, but they just needed to figure out how to get them from somewhere where they were worth not very much to somewhere where they were worth a lot more. So this is where they set up these trails, these cattle trails, and they started to drive the cows northwards. These were called long drives. And driving, obviously, it's not like driving a car. They had people all around on horses, usually between 10 and 15. The average crew was 11 people, and they'd just be around the cows and telling them, shouting at them which way to go. But these very long distances covered here. Once they got them to some of these places, so we're talking about Kansas and Missouri, they would then put them onto trains, which would transport them east. There are a few names mentioned here, which we are going to talk about a bit later. So we've got Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving. We've got John Iliffe, and we've got Joseph McCoy. We'll be mentioning these a little bit later. So while they were going on these long drives and taking the cattle from one place to another, they were able to do this because there were such massive areas of open land and grassland that the cows could then eat on. As it says there, Charles Goodnight, one of the people who opened up a trail, basically he bought small patches of land all around, and then what that meant was nobody else wanted the land in between his little bits of land, so therefore he effectively owned all of the land, and that was called inventing the crazy quilt system of owning land. And later, so by 1885, there were 35 cattle barons which owned 8 million hectares of range and owned 1.5 million cattle. So these were very powerful people. A baron is basically just a very powerful person who owns land or a lot of money, effectively. In our later period of study, so obviously we only actually look up until 1885, but it's worth knowing that by 1890 the open range had effectively died due to overgrazing. So there was too many cows eating all that grass, and there was overstocking. So they were trying to breed too many cows, which led to a fall in their price, their value. There was also weather conditions such as droughts, hot summers and winter storms. We know what life on the plains was like, very, very hard, different conditions, both extremes. And there were homesteaders as well, and we're going to look at this later in terms of the homesteaders and the effect that the ranchers and the cowboys and the homesteaders had on each other. There were also issues with fencing, people fencing off the land, and the invention of barbed wire meant you couldn't easily move your animals through areas of land quickly. Okay, so just to sum up, there are some things that you need to know, the basics about the cattle industry. You need to know the transportation, so how did they actually manage to get those cows from one place to another. So we had the railroads, very important, developed throughout our time, our period of study, definitely in the mid-19th century, in the 1860s in particular. The long drive, as I say, going from the south in Texas northwards to the train stations in places like Kansas and Missouri. And the cowboys, very, very responsible, not the cowboys that you see in the movies with their, pistols, although they may have had a pistol, but they wouldn't really be able to fire them. They were not particularly educated people. They weren't particularly, brave or suave people. They were working, they were working class, quite often covered in muck, and they did one job really, which was to take cows from one place to another. But that was their job to do that. The markets, as in who were they selling to? They were selling to miners. They were selling to the reservations and the Native Americans. They were selling to the big industrial developing cities, and they were selling to the people building the railroads as well. These are the people that they sold their cattle to. How and why did it develop? Well, the trails were developed, and I'll show you a map of that next. There were cow towns, and again, on the map, you'll be able to see some of the cow towns that developed. The development of ranching and the use of the open range was also very important. The development wasn't without its challenges, and as you can see there, the Civil War was an issue for the development of the cattle industry, as well as helping it in some ways. It was also an issue, as well as Indian attacks made it difficult for people to move that cattle efficiently. Rustling, people stealing those cows. You had, as I say, the settlers and the farmers, so those homesteaders and those farmers arguing against the people who were trying to drive cattle from one place to another. Part of the reason for that was because there was things like Texas fever, which was a disease that these cows got, which was passed on from, just being in the same sort of field or the same area, eating the same grass, all that sort of stuff, and it killed the cattle. So obviously, if you were a farmer with some cattle in Kansas, then you wouldn't necessarily want some Texas cattle coming through your field. So that was an issue for those people in the cattle industry as well. Okay, so these are some of the trails that you can see here, and the red lines are the railroads that ran from east to west, west to east, whichever way you're looking at it, I guess. Some of the main things to point out here, some of the key individuals that we're going to be talking about. John Iliffe was from around this area. This is where he managed to build up his business. The Goodnight Loving Trail is this one here. Okay, so going up through the New Mexico territory into Colorado. You've also got Abilene and the Chisholm Trail. Okay, so very important area, and it replaced Sedalia over here, Sedalia, not sure of the pronunciation, because obviously as this railway line expands, it's easier just to go straight up than having to come across through here. And Missouri farmers in particular did not like the cattle drives coming through their land. And again, it goes further. As the railway lines come further across, these towns. So Sedalia to begin with, then Abilene, and then you end up with some other towns like Ellsworth getting bigger as well. Joseph McCoy, or the real McCoy, where that phrase actually comes from, was a very, very successful businessman, and he operated out of Abilene, buying up land around there, encouraging the use of the railroad, encouraging the Texas cattlemen to come up through and use his trail of the Chisholm Trail. So he was very, very successful. He marketed his own ventures. He created hotels, and basically he was trying to really set up this industry, and he was very successful in doing that. The Goodnight Loving Trail, pioneered by Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving, was is still one of the most famous trails for the cattlemen. Their biggest success was they were able to sell directly to the Indian reservations, rather than driving their cattle up to the railway lines and then selling them on for them to then go east. They cut out that middleman, and they were able to sell directly to the reservations, the Indians. Sadly, Oliver Loving died in 1867 when he was shot in a Comanche attack. But Charles Goodnight lived to a ripe old age, and he was very, very successful, and he had a 1 million acre ranch. So acre is a word that you'll have seen a lot of. A football pitch is about 2 acres, so that gives you an idea of how much land Charles Goodnight had. 1 million acres. Okay. John Iliffe, as previously mentioned, had some land around Colorado, and he built up Denver City. He was effectively, his biggest thing was that he set up ranches. He basically started building ranches and selling beef onwards from there to mining towns, to people building the railroads, to the Indian reservations. So including in 1872 providing beef to 7,000 Sioux Indians. He stopped the drives, really. He stopped the cattle drives, and it was the start of a new phase, which was ranching. Okay, so actually fencing areas off, not always moving them from one place to another. Finally, we have the development of the cattle barons. As previously mentioned, they are these very powerful people who have a lot of land and make a lot of money from the cattle industry. Very high profits, and lots of investors putting money into the cattle industry. Again, going from John Iliffe and his example that he set, the cattle barons had these big ranches in various areas, all around the south of America. Lots of influence. They were the people who controlled the politics and the land in their particular areas, and they were the new big businessmen, particularly in those southern states. Okay, so that's that really. Obviously, do all the work that is set for you, and start having to think about this question here. Who do you think was the most significant individual in the development of the cattle industry? It's important for you to start having your own thoughts about this sort of thing. It helps you understand what we've looked at better. And also, very important, and this is a bit of a clue here, make sure that you are aware of this question. You know that you've got a narrative account. Think about how you would answer it. All right, you know that your exam will include a narrative account. So let's have a look at this one. And let's think about how we could write a narrative account about the cattle industry. Okay, obviously I'll be checking all your work, make sure that you get it all done, and I shall see you next time.